Hello.
McKenna should be here shortly.
Okay, yeah, some quiet here because students have some orientation at the moment about field trips. So there's only one student here and then a few more online.
Okay.
I'm not sure if Felipe is joining us today, but Professor Ota cannot join us.
I saw that. I saw that.
And I'm not sure if he will be here too.
Okay.
Well, that owl thing is pretty weird. I'm seeing your picture divided up into three strips.
Hi. Oh, Brandon, I don't know if you got the notifications, but I set up a Google Doc. With,
Yeah, I saw them on my way into university today. So I haven't had a chance to sit down and access them yet, but thanks for getting the ball rolling on that.
yeah,
Okay.
so I have a few questions that need your attention before we can kind of like say that the
Okay.
results are what they are. Just for like the sake of interpretation, we would, based on what you say, we would either remove the model or change how we've interpreted it. So, yeah.
Okay. I'll get back to you this afternoon once class is over and I get home.
Yeah, and then we'll finish it tomorrow, and I'll send, and that should include the qualitative coding too. So that means we'll be done from this end at least.
Fantastic. How was your field trip to Fiji? Did you have a good?
It was excellent. So I'm sorry, I left at a very stressful time. But yeah, it was interesting to be somewhere else when the results were being announced here.
Ah, right. Yeah, that's true. You decided to come back though, didn't you?
Oh, no, I told my students we have to come back.
I
Yeah.
saw some news item this morning about houses that are selling for $1 in Tuscany being very attractive for Americans.
I want to know about a dollar house in Tuscany. How do I go? And will they give me a?
Shall I send you the link?
Yeah. Yes. My friend and I.
He has a dollar, we're in a hole in our pocket.
Yeah.
Do we have a dollar to spare?
I need to go buy a house.
You can always come to Japan. We have plenty of vacant houses. I think there's about 8 million available. So yeah, you can get a real bargain.
Wow, 8 million vacant houses. That's a different whole kind of problem.
It is. It's actually become a trend now with many international people buying these houses and renovating them.
Yeah, I saw ABC Australia did a documentary on Australians who've moved to Japan because housing in Australia is about as crazy as it is in here in Hawaii. And so like interviewing those Australians who've moved over to see like the quality of life and if they think they made the right choice. They all say they made the right choice.
Oh yeah.
What are the residency requirements for land ownership in Japan?
Think that basically people come over, buy the property, and then try and figure out how they can spend the maximum amount of time in Japan. Then if you have an employer of some sort, then you can apply for residency through them. And also it depends on the number of years that you spend in Japan as well. It's
so there is no minimum.
possible.
Like you can be a non-resident homeowner as long as you want.
Yeah.
Okay. That was a really specific question.
It is. Shall I? There's lots and lots of sites where you can check out houses here. But anyway, next time you come to Japan, I'll show you around.
I thought you were pulling some up right now.
Oh, houses, no, I just, wait, I had a little issue with like the mouse and the system, so I just wanted to pull everything up and have it be up here for you.
Um,
Hi, Wolfgang. So, Brendan, let me know when you think we should get started. I see students are kind of trickling into your classroom, so we can chat for a few more minutes and if you want.
Actually, I think it's fine to start. I mean, we only have McKenna presenting today.
Yeah.
So we can go at a leisurely pace and have a lot of time for interaction, which would be great.
Okay, so I'll get started. I'll moderate today. I'll introduce McKenna to everyone and then I'll hand over to you.
and should I go there? Is that the easiest for
I
me?
think we'll do the slides for you also. It just, I think it'll depend on if like Brendan and his classroom can hear you, which I think. Can you hear McKenna just fine for now?
And
Test.
McKenna, can you say something, McKenna?
It's very nice to see you, Brendan.
Yeah, fine. We can hear you fine. It's nice to see you as well.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
It's up to you, like, if you want to come up here, you can, or I can move the slides too, so.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll introduce Professor Kaufman and then hand it over to her to take us through the presentation today. So Dr. McKenna Kaufman serves as the director for the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, the ISR, here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her interests include greenhouse gas reduction strategies, renewable energy planning and policy, low carbon transportation, sea level rise response. She specializes in regional economy, environmental modeling with expertise in energy and climate policy. She is also a research fellow with the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization and has contributed to the Department of Urban and Regional Planning for decades in both direction, leadership, and mentoring, and continues to mentor students in DOE. Very excited to have you here, McKenna. She's going to talk to us about lessons from Hawaii in climate action.
Great. I'll just come up there. That way you can
Okay.
sit down. You don't have to press
Okay,
the slides.
So let me share this screen. And then hand it over to you. Brendan, can you see the slides? Are they okay?
It's about cut off halfway through. And doesn't seem to be in presentation mode.
Just 1 second, let me.
What classrooms do we have connected and how many students are online? I can see this. Okay,
15 students online.
okay, great.
Is that better, Brendan?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, McKenna.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Subhashini. Going back and forth a little bit, I decided I would talk about greenhouse gas mitigation. Subhashini read from the intro. I'm also really interested in sea level rise adaptation topics, but it sounded like you guys have covered that quite a bit. So I want to dive deeply into greenhouse gas issues, specifically in Hawaii, but really hopefully to make the tie between, you know, local action to regional action to national and global action. So the other reason I thought I paused and thought I really should focus on greenhouse gas emissions today is, you know, because COP29 is occurring right now. I don't know to the extent to which you guys have covered issues of COP.
In like our discussion, but we haven't talked about COP29.
No one's talking about COP29.
That's because of where it is.
Right, exactly. So, this is an issue, right? That the international negotiations, they do go places, but sort of year to year, they have different levels of importance. And I think for the folks who have been working in this space for a very long time, which is getting to be me included, it's very frustrating, right? Because it's not meeting this, the policies are not meeting the speed of the science, what the science demands. So probably the last COP that was extremely influential was the 2015 Conference of Parties, which we kind of colloquially refer to now as the Paris Agreement, right? And the Paris Agreement was a really important moment where the global community got together and said, you know, we are going to really, really try to stay under 2 degrees of warming. You know, at this point, we're over 1 degree of warming, right? So we're gonna start really do our best to stay under 2 degrees and, you know, really ambitiously go to the 1.5. Which we're kind of at the doorstep of 1.5 any moment. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of details about this in terms of the mechanisms. And ultimately it comes down to the combination of voluntary mechanisms, transfer of aid, and a lot of, you know, public shaming if you don't make your targets, right? That was kind of the plan. But just a few years later, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, had run on a platform of the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement, right? So, you know, it did not take too long for this to sort of get undone. The US did not actually pull out of the Paris Agreement except for 1 month because of the mechanism. It was kind of foreseen that this could happen. But that's sort of irrelevant, right? That's kind of a technical point. And the truth is that the US didn't actually progress climate policy in the 4 years. Anyhow, with the national stage of, you know, of the US pulling out of the climate agreement, it became really important for US states to step up and say, we are still gonna meet targets, right? And this was another reason why I reflected on why I should give this talk today, right? Because we're in that another important moment of, we know that the federal government is undoing climate policies, right? Actively stated as part of the agenda. But this is where the US is kind of an interesting governance place, right? Because we have this multi-level governance structure very, very deeply where states have a lot of authority. What states do can really matter. And so this is kind of a moment for that to kick in again. So again,
This
let's go
happened last week
backwards.
as well,
This is
didn't
oh, sorry.
Brendan, did you say something?
Sorry, we dropped out for a bit there.
Oh, okay. Are we good?
Yep.
Going back, this is a newspaper clipping from 2018, when basically, you know, the Trump administration had run on a platform of pulling out of the Paris Agreement in 2016. And so then there was a process of US states saying, we're still in. And so the state legislature passed a law that said Hawaii is going to be part of the states that do this. And we're going to become, like, the language is carbon net negative by the year 2045, or as soon as practicable. So the idea was we could do this before, but definitely by 2045. And it was a really kind of great moment. You can see the picture of the governor signing the bill and how important it was. And afterwards, everyone said, how do we do that, right? And so this is where the university comes in with the research arm and kind of that bridge between research and policy. And so I've been working a lot on this for the last 6 years of how do we do this, right? One of the things that ISR, a collaboration between ISR and the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization does is develop the state's greenhouse gas emissions and forecasts on an annual basis. And this is in collaboration with another consulting company called ICF International, who also does the US National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And what we focus on are the projections to the year 2045. And this is basically under our air quality branch of the Department of Health, right? Where they are authorized and kind of, you know, tagged with putting this greenhouse gas emissions under an air quality umbrella, which is a little bit of a kind of strange thing. But they have the authority to regulate emissions. So stepping back a little bit, this is what Hawaii's emissions look like for the years in which we have completed inventories. And we actually just delivered 2022. So we do have an update, but it's not public yet. So what you can see really quickly here is that energy is our problem, right? That is our really large fossil fuel source. We don't have inventories for every single year. We do have it going back to 1990 at the latest. And so for the years in which we have complete inventories, 2007 was the peak of our emissions. And then it dropped. This is actually cut off. We do have some inventory years in between. But one of the things that is notable between the 2007 and 2017 drop is, you know, it really, really dropped between 2007 and 2010. And that was when we had a huge recession, right? So there was an economic driver to that emissions reductions. And in 2010 is when the state started taking seriously policies that would switch out fossil fuels for renewable energy. And so we did see that emissions slowed, right? And you can see that from the 2017 to 2019 numbers, where emissions have slowed their growth from the initial post-recession drop. And this is not enough, right? Like, slowing your growth is not what we're going for. It's of course good news. It's in the right direction because the economy was actually growing considerably with this. And so in terms of an intensity, we've improved tremendously. But the climate doesn't actually care about the economic intensity of greenhouse gas emissions, right? It needs greenhouse gas emissions to actually decline. So then you get the big experiment of COVID, right? And you can see 2020. And it's actually surprising to me that emissions did not drop further in this time period, right? Think about the dramatic shutdowns we had, right? The stay-at-home orders, the fact that our 90% of our flights were canceled and grounded for almost the entire year, right? And yet, you know, emissions dropped, but again, not as dramatically as you'd think, right? And of course, reducing emissions by global pandemic is not the way we want to do this. So the question is sort of what are the policies in place to move this forward? Also, last note on the slide is that post-COVID, our emissions have rebounded, right, with our economic activity. So greenhouse gas emissions are fundamentally a reflection of a combination of the levels of economic activities, the types of economic activities, and the types of fuels we use to keep those economic activities going. So it's primarily an energy problem, that big blue, right, which is what we see here, almost 90%. And it's for Hawaii, it's also predominantly a carbon dioxide problem, right? We do have methane emissions are, you know, a big deal, and this is accounting for global warming potential. So accounting for the fact that methane has a much, much higher global warming potential, but not nearly as big of a deal as fossil fuel burning and carbon dioxide emissions, right? So for us, it's not really land use change. For us, it's not really the creation of methane within landfills, right? Not to say those things are unimportant, they're just not the elephant in the room. And this is our projections into the future. So what you'll notice is that the light blue from 2025 to 2045 in our baseline projection, we have trending downwards, and the dark blue barely changes. So the light blue is stationary emissions, and so this is our emissions that we're projecting will come from our electric sector. And this is mainly because we have a policy in place called a renewable portfolio standard that requires that 100% of our electricity generation be done through renewable sources by the year 2045. So it's really sort of like the electricity mirror of our carbon target, right? This, even in our baseline, we actually don't think we're on track to hit it, which is why that light blue doesn't go entirely away. So we've adjusted a bit. I think our baseline is pretty rosy. We've since this year made our baseline look less rosy than this. But that is the policy that's driving emissions down in the electric sector, and you know, could stay on track to do so. The transportation emissions are totally different story though, right? We do have some federal policies in place that do move the needle on emissions substantially, but not quickly. And that's corporate average fuel economy standards. And basically that's how fuel efficient our cars are. And for those of you who've driven around the streets in the United States, our cars are very fuel inefficient, right? So the United States back led fuel efficiency in vehicles decades ago, and we lost that standing decades ago. So all countries in the world have really surpassed us on fuel efficiency of vehicles. Instead, we've moved our cars to bigger cars, right? Which are heavy, which take more fuel to run. And so CAFE standards have both caused this problem and are a solution to the problem. So what we have in that transportation forecast there is a combination of sort of how we expect federal fuel efficiency standards to play out on our roads in Hawaii, as well as expectations around aviation, which really we don't expect to change much. There isn't a lot on the horizon in our baseline forecast. We do have some like very rosy technology innovative forecasts that include switching to sustainable aviation fuels, for example, or electrifying short flights. These are small scale, even in this baseline forecast, we do actually put a considerable amount of sustainable aviation fuel in here, but it doesn't move the needle that much, just given the volume of air travel. All right, keep moving here. So these are the states that, so the renewable portfolio standard that we have here in Hawaii is a pretty common policy across the US. And this goes back to sort of the importance of states in the US for policy, right? That we do not have a federal energy standard, which is, most countries have a federal energy standard, I should say. We do not. Instead, we have a patchwork of kind of ad hoc standards done at the state level. It's definitely not ideal, but it's there and it matters, right? That we do have 30 states plus DC that have an RPS. They're very hard to compare because they're done at different time scales with different types of energy, the renewable energy sources that count towards them, with different targets. The kind of interesting thing though is for a while it was a race amongst states to do better, right? So California was really leading the way on RPS things, and Hawaii signed the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative in 2010 and said, oh wait, we should be the best at this. And so we declared that that's when we put our 100% by the year 2045 rule in place. And then California said, well, you can't do better than us because we're California. So then they changed their policy. And actually all of the states with hatched lines changed their policies after Hawaii changed their policy. So if we're gonna compete, this is like a really, really good competition, right? Let's compete for who can have more renewable energy on the grid. Like that sounds great. So this is called, like policy diffusion, right? We can think about places that have policies and then it spreads to other places. And in the US, energy policy diffusion has been really, really critical to kind of getting this broader. So I wanted to talk about this for a second because we can also think about this in our next topic of carbon tax policy diffusion, right? In the US, policy doesn't always happen with the, one federal policy. It does sometimes, right? Like fuel efficiency standards, but it doesn't always. You can also think about state policies becoming regional approaches, becoming national policy, right? So a couple of years ago, let's see, we did this study in 2021. The state legislature requested that UH think about how would a carbon tax get us to our greenhouse gas goals, right? So we have our forecasting work, and the answer from that is we are not on track, right? Like sure, emissions under a very pretty rosy baseline are going down, but that is not the goal. The goal isn't to just trend downwards. The goal is to get to net negative by 2045. So how do we do substantially better? What could a carbon price do? So for the carbon pricing can be either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. They're economically equal in terms of the price signal they send if they're set up in similar ways, right? A cap and trade system can be economically equal to a quota system if they're set up poorly, right? So this is kind of the criticism of cap and trade programs is that they can be manipulated in different ways, but a good cap and trade system is identical to a carbon tax system, right? So I use these terms interchangeably, and because of that, I'm just gonna call it a carbon price, right? You can do it either way. Administratively, they're extremely different, but in terms of their economic impacts, they're the same, right? So, or actually, I'm gonna say the carbon tax because it's easier, right, to just think about. So if you introduce a carbon tax, right, then for Hawaii, this is actually very simple. Effectively, we already have a carbon tax because we tax a barrel of oil upon entry, right? We have a barrel of oil fee. And it was actually already extended to natural gas. And then our coal power plant was recently shuttered. So we only really have oil and natural gas here. So it is actually levied on all sources of fossil fuels at this point. So we can think about that barrel tax, that extended barrel tax, just being, raised extensively, so that we really have a meaningful price signal, right? So if you had a meaningful price signal under a carbon tax policy, this basically increases the price of polluting, right? This also gels really, really well with what we think about like a polluter pays principle, right? You're taxing the pollution, polluters pays, and then this goes through our economy in a price signal of things have to change now, right? So by increasing the price of pollution, you've increased the cost of polluting goods and services, and this goes downstream. So now you get lower greenhouse gas products are relatively cheaper than they were before. So people will trend towards them. This spurs technology adoption, it spurs consumer behavior changes, and then ultimately people do that, right? And then greenhouse gas emissions fall. So that's the mechanism behind a carbon tax. And the question is, by how much, right? And there's a lot of rhetoric around carbon taxes, right? Like right now, British Columbia, for example, has one of the longest standing carbon taxes in North America. And I don't know if any of you guys follow Canadian politics, but there's a huge axe the tax movement right now, right? And a lot of the rhetoric is, well, it's varied. But one of the important things that we hear a lot is carbon taxes don't work, right? Because if you have a carbon tax, why aren't emissions zero? Like, well, that's not how they were intended to work, right? A low carbon tax will give you really low emissions reductions, and a high carbon tax will give you really high emissions reductions. So it's all about the price level, right? And I will say that the prices have gone up because we've waited so long. When analyses like these were done 20 years ago, the carbon tax for the entire country would have had to be, let's see, in 2002-ish dollars, I think, $10, which I think I recently did a back of the envelope, which is equivalent to $18 a metric ton of carbon today. And that would have substantially changed our entire tech sector in the US 20 years ago, right? And because we waited, because we sort of followed this path, the costs have added up, right? This is the cost of inaction. So now we're looking at much higher prices in order to move the needle. So this is a state level carbon tax analysis where we said, okay, let's just pick two price pathways. One that is politically high. I don't want to call it a low carbon tax because $50 to $70 a ton would still be politically a high carbon tax. Let's see what that gets us. We chose that number because it's actually the estimated federal social cost of carbon in the US. So this is a number, maybe you guys talked about this? No?
It's one of the reasons.
Oh, great. All right. So for everyone else on Zoom, the US federal social cost of carbon is, it uses a couple of different integrated assessment models to say what is the global damage cost of one additional metric ton of CO2 in the entire world, right? So it is supposed to be a global perspective. It was originally initiated under the Obama administration, and the Biden administration has kept it up, and it's supposed to be used for federal internal decision-making for cost-benefit analyses. Everyone at this point is really happy that the Biden administration kept it going. That said, there was tremendous criticism of it as not properly including uncertainty. And if you include uncertainty, the number gets a lot higher, right? So this $50 to $70 number is sort of, in my view, adequate. Like, let's pick it as adequate, right? There's some good models behind it. There's reason to think that it's okay. we probably know it's a little low. And then we said, what if we just choose a really big number? Because we know it's gonna take more. And so we just chose something that went up to $1,000 by 2045 and said, let's perturbate our model to see what happens to greenhouse gas emissions and the economy when you put on a really big carbon tax. So we built an economic model. This is something my research group has been building and maintaining for quite some time now. It's a kind of broad economic model that incorporates both consumer demand, production and supply, as well as has full price feedbacks and a representation of government spending. And one of the reasons that we had taken on the work of doing the government's greenhouse gas forecasting is because we wanted to be able to integrate that into our economic model one day. So we sort of got very, very familiar with the greenhouse gas data, and then in this project, put those two data sets together so that then we were able to track, basically flow out all greenhouse gas emissions and where it goes sector to sector in Hawaii's economy. And that model gives us these basic results. So kind of wrapped all of that up into greenhouse gas emissions and economic indicators. So on the top, we can see our greenhouse gas emissions forecast. Let's just take 2025 to 2045. So the very top number is our baseline, and that's the number in gray. And actually, if I put up the histogram of greenhouse gas emissions forecast, it looks really similar, right? It's kind of the same policies that are propelling our baseline forward, the same federal fuel efficiency standards, RPS, right? And so then now we layer on the carbon tax level. And when we put on the federal social cost of carbon tax, we get an approximate 10% reduction between 2025 and 2045, right? So basically we go from the gray line to the light tealish line, right? And so even though politically, I'd say it's a high carbon tax, and it does reduce your emissions substantially, right? That's notable. 10% is nothing to scoff at. It's also not deep decarbonization, right? When we put on the $1,000 carbon tax level, now we're talking deep decarbonization. It still doesn't get to zero. We did a kind of cost abatement curve assessment, and really you get to this huge inflection point after about $3,000 a ton, where you have to push your cost up so high to actually get to zero, right? So the question is like, what is going to be your backstop technology? It's probably some kind of carbon offset program or biofuels program that is pretty decent, at least in Hawaii, and actually globally, I'll say that's true too. So getting to zero is really hard economically, but we can definitely get to deep decarbonization, right? And so this is a 70% reduction in emissions from 2025 to 2045. And the pathway matters, right? Even though our goals are often focused on like 1 year, that's not how emissions work, right? Emissions are cumulative in our atmosphere. So the pathway matters. Reducing emissions now matters a lot, right? In terms of economic indicators, one of the things that struck me, and this is more like, again, like the model tells us what the model tells us, and then what we make of it is more normative, right? I was struck at how little this affected the economy, right? It does affect the economy. It is a negative contraction to the economy. There's sort of no way around that. It's a tax, right? It's a contractionary tax. It forces change and structural change. And we are not a place where we have like tech innovation, right? Some places you could imagine modeling out like tech innovation that spurs renewable energy development and sales and exports, but that's not our economy, right? So here we're putting on a contractionary tax. But I was struck at how little it affected it, right? So in the social cost of carbon taxation, it is less than 0.5% in the year 2045 of economic contraction. So that's relatively small. And under a baseline of growth, like you might not notice that, right? The $1,000 a ton is considerably larger. It's a considerably larger economic contraction. It's almost 5%. Like that's notable, right? So now we get into this conversation around what should Hawaii do if it's going alone or if it's part of a regional collaboration, because that really matters here, right? So let's hold that thought, because what we found in terms of welfare impact suggests that Hawaii could actually benefit from a carbon tax, even if it's going it alone, right? So we looked at different ways to use the carbon revenues, right, the tax revenues that come in. And we allocated them with two fundamental kind of different assumptions. We actually did a whole nother study that looked at like many different assumptions of allocation, and it's all pretty robust to what I'm gonna say here. So we looked at two different allocations. One was, what if we just plus up government spending, right? We have this new source of taxation. We have new tax revenues to the state. What if we just put that into the government budget? And rather than make assumptions about the way the government would spend that, let's proportionately plus up everything the government currently spends on, right? So schools get better, roads get better, everything gets a little bit more in terms of its current spending patterns. The other assumption was, what if the government gets none of it? There is a caveat to that. Air travel has to go back to the government because there's a federal law that says any kind of taxation within the aviation sector has to be reinvested in the aviation sector. So that's like a really small aside, but it's an important thing. So anyways, excluding aviation, what if everything else goes back to households as a dividend? We did not make, in this study, we did in other studies. In this study, we did not make any judgments about how that should be shared out. We just wanted to start with, what if everybody gets an equal share of the dividend? We divided this up, we gave it back to the households. What happens? Okay, so this is our 2045 result down at the bottom. And it's a little confusing, but the y-axis is the zero line, right? Positive to negative. And basically the pink and purple runs are the cases where the dividend is given back, right? The pink run is when the dividend is given back under the social cost of carbon. And the purple run is when the dividend is given back under the $1,000. And the horizontal line is household income. And we broke households up by quintiles. So I will pause and say this was our most amazing data work. Took forever because we basically decomposed consumer spending from the federal consumer spending data. We matched it to Hawaii, and then we matched it to all of the greenhouse gas data, right? So now we're able to talk about households by income group, by the way that they consume energy intensive goods and services, right? And so this, on the horizontal axis, the lowest income quintiles are more towards the y-axis, right, the 15,000, and the highest income quintile is on the other end, right, so low to high. And the notable thing about these purple and pink bars is that most of them are on the top. Most of them are above the zero. This flabbergasted me the first time we did this run, and I was like, we made a mistake, let's go back and check our math, like something can't be right, right? So not only is it progressive meaning that it relatively benefits low-income households, right? Which you can see from the shape of that curve, right? It's progressive. It's not just progressive, it's positive. And the positive part puzzled me because I've not seen that in this type of study. Mostly carbon taxation is found to be progressive. National studies have all shown it's progressive. For us, we found it was positive. And it took a little bit of sleuthing. We didn't make a math error. It's a really simple explanation. It's because we have such a tourism-intensive economy, and tourists pay 25 to 30% of the carbon tax revenues, depending on the year you're looking at. And so it becomes a huge pot of money from sort of an external transfer to households. And that's why they're actually made better off than they were before. So you see that this is actually across the board in the social cost of carbon run, right? The light pink, the very highest income household here is like, you can barely see it, but it's actually positive. And then in the really high carbon tax run, it's only negative in the top two quintiles. So I'd say these are relatively wealthy households to begin with, right? This is not personally my biggest concern, right? I'm really caring about those last two quintiles or three quintiles. So it's positive, and particularly it's very positive for the lowest income quintile. So the reason for this, just to give you some intuition, is because relatively speaking, low-income households spend more of their income on transportation fuels and electricity. They spend less of their income on things like air travel, right? So there's a proportional energy burden into low-income households, right, relative to income. But in terms of total energy consumption, it's far, far less. And the revenues are a reflection of total energy consumption. And so when you divide that up equally and give it back to households, it relatively benefits the low-income households. Interestingly, we found kind of the opposite for government spending, which is kind of a sad state of affairs. So we found that if we give it back to government spending and proportional spending, that it's not only negative, it's regressive, meaning it relatively does not benefit low-income households. So this really shaped my thinking personally about the way a carbon tax should be structured in Hawaii. And I think if we're gonna kind of say we care about equity, which I do personally, but as a state and the way we were talking about policy, we say this, then we need to craft it with a dividend, right? This is the way to make it an equitable policy and a just transition. So carbon taxes are a really, really, really promising approach in Hawaii. We found that it was not economically devastating and could actually be beneficial for households, right? A lot of devils in the details about like, how do you actually work that out? How do you administer the tax, right? And we've actually done a lot of work on that part of it, right? How do you actually get down to the point of doing it? But I also want to say it's not a panacea, right? Setting the price structure is just the starting point. But it makes all the other work a lot easier, right? If you get the umbrella of the price structure right, then things like investing in public transit become a lot easier because now you've gotten a positive feedback loop, right? People are now driving your car is relatively more expensive, so people are thinking about the bus more. And then if the bus service gets better, then you further reinforce that positive feedback loop, right? But you do need to think about shaking loose these other barriers for people to make those choices, right? You need to make the greenhouse gas choices, the low greenhouse gas choices, the easy choices. Otherwise, we just don't do them, right? It's hard to do the hard thing all the time. So how do we do that? Again, the pricing is really important, but then we have to have these other interventions. So the next project that our research group took on was working with the city and county of Honolulu on their first ever climate action plan. And it's 2020 to 2025 period, so it's coming up pretty soon and they're starting to redo this work. And we boiled this down to 9 very, very ambitious strategies for them and something like 43 actions, right? So it was a really ambitious starting point. It was probably too ambitious as a planning document, but a really good start as like a framework for what they do over like the next 20 years. So I won't talk about all of these, but I think the biggest ones from a greenhouse gas standpoint for the city are really about number 7, seeing through the RPS, right? So the renewable portfolio standard for us is a state policy, but it's the city that has the authority to permit or not permit these projects. And it's the city who manages land use, right? So one of the biggest barriers, well, there's been a few, right? So among the biggest barriers for renewable energy projects in the state has really been about land use conflicts and how do we shake some of those through. So this is just one example of the kind of innovative work that people are doing here that I think is really, really important to keep pushing on renewable energy. So, if this gets to scale, that's going to be a long, long ways away, right? But again, how do we think about innovative land uses where we can co-locate activities? So what you're looking at here is a picture of a student-led project on our agricultural research. I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but anyways, within one of our agricultural parks. And this was a student's like master's thesis as well as like life passion. So she was able to demonstrate an agrivoltaic system and really test out different kinds of crops and their growth patterns and the ones that did particularly well with shade. As well as document some of the water reduction needs for agriculture as a result of having the shade. So, right, if we can think about co-location, if we can think about multiple benefits, then we're starting to mitigate some of those land use concerns, right? Because what I think people are understandably wary about is committing these lands into basically these industrial energy systems in a way that we can't take back, right? So, I will also pause and say post Lahaina wildfire. So after that horrible tragedy, there is a lot of rethinking about land management, right? And particularly land management for fuels reduction. And so it's kind of opened the conversation to things like solar photovoltaic, particularly in ag lands, if you can have this type of co-location. Because now you're at least talking about a managed space, right? A space managed at this level is no longer the fire risk if it's in comparative fallow. So again, sort of understanding these land use trade-offs and the benefits of the co-location is one of the things that ISR is working on. Actually, Prava, who's very much on the screen right now, is working on. She's just trying to scoot back and get off the screen, but that is one of the projects she's on right now. So the other really important greenhouse gas thing for the city, probably the most important, is encouraging different types of transportation, right? How do we actually move the needle on that dark blue transportation, right? Beyond federal fuel efficiency standards. So the elephant in this conversation is cars and trucks that we all drive, right? These are, it's not the city bus, it's not the heavy duty, it's not the heavy duty fleet vehicles like FedEx, right? They all contribute, they're all important, but they are not the major greenhouse gas emissions problems. It is the private cars and trucks that we all collectively drive every day that are 86% of greenhouse gas emissions within the sector. So it's really about moving that needle. And electric vehicles are certainly going to play a part in that, right? Absolutely going to play a part in that. Done a lot of research on EV adoption and trends, and I'm actually really like positive about the way that EV trends are going right now. It's sort of reaching that, beginning of adoption curve where you can see diffusion happening, which is really exciting. But I will say it is slow from a greenhouse gas standpoint, right? Once you actually pull this back into percentages of registered vehicles on the road and how does that translate to emissions, it ends up being non-satisfying. So this is just a quick graph of EVs on the road in Hawaii. And an interesting thing, right? So the literature on technology diffusion suggests that the more disruptive the technology, the faster it often diffuses. And you can see that when you look at battery electric vehicles, so that dark teal EVs in comparison to plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, right? Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are just like a slight difference from traditional hybrid vehicles. And they're taking off a lot slower in comparison to full BEVs, which is a much higher curve, and you can imagine the adoption going much faster, right? So we're definitely still not at that like major inflection point where this becomes the majority of the market, but I don't think it's completely out there to say, like, in terms of forecasts, that we could have a majority of EVs on the road by 2045. To sort of temper the enthusiasm, to compare it to, a technology that is not as disruptive, but hybrid electric vehicles, right? We're still at only 2.5% of cars on the road in the state as hybrid vehicles. And that's not a disruptive technology at all, right? Like, cars basically the same. Again, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but often more disruptive technology gets adopted faster. So we'll see. So I'll say EVs are important, but they're also not the panacea, right? We need to focus on reducing how far people drive as well, right? And the other sort of, elephant is that people are driving really far and they're driving alone. So this is census data. And you can just see, if you look at 2021, 56% of people are driving alone in their car and truck, right? Interestingly, we're amazing at carpooling in the state. So in comparison to the rest of the country. So we have the highest carpooling rates of any like counties together in comparison to other counties, which shocked me when I went through the census data at this level. I don't have an explanation for that, but it strikes me as interesting.
Zipper lane.
The zipper lane, there you go. It's on the Big Island though, it's actually the highest. The Big Island is 15%. Yeah. But Oahu is really high too. So yeah, as a general, as a state, we're high on carpooling relative to other counties. Okay, so then we have 4% as public transportation. And that is, you can see a decline in public transit, right? In 2015, it was 8%. then went down to 7, and then 6, and then the pandemic happened and it jumped to 4. So there has been a 2-decade, maybe a 3-decade decline in bus ridership in the state. And the pandemic was just sort of like a further nail in that coffin. So turning that around has been like our major recommendation working with the city, right? If you do nothing else, focusing on making bus service better. Interestingly, work from home has endured post-COVID, but when we looked at the research on work from home in the US context, it is not a greenhouse gas saver. That the rebound effect tends to be really, really large, that people tend to live further away and or go on longer, bigger leisure trips. So overall greenhouse gas reductions from work from home are really, really modest if at all. When we're thinking about interventions into the transit system, the other thing that's really important is this is an equity action, right? It's not just, the greenhouse gas emission side of it, right? Transit is an overall accessibility problem, or opportunity, right? And if you just focus on EVs, which is important, absolutely important, you're gonna miss this. You're gonna miss this side of it, right? And so this is just census data showing how people get around by income group. And you can see that the lowest income groups walk and take public transit, right? So this is absolutely the importance of making sure that those transportation options are safe, right? And convenient and get you to work on time, right? I will say we are absolutely failing on these two fronts. That our public transit here is terrible, does not get you to work on time. And we have one of the highest numbers of sort of relative pedestrian deaths in the country. So these are things that if you or any of you are transportation planning interested, like pay attention to these, right? It's really, really important. And then how does this roll up into greenhouse gas emissions? So this is just transportation greenhouse gas emissions for Oahu, right? And as I said, the lion's share is private cars and trucks. This is our forecast for how fuel efficiency standards will make their way in. And you can see that things like private buses and city buses are important, right? And other heavy duty vehicles. So that gray is like all the FedEx trucks, right? They're important, but they're not the lion's share. This is just our baseline forecast. And then we can think about how do we reduce it, right? So electrification matters, right? So we have in that very first slice, what if the entire city fleet, including the buses, electrified? And that includes everything we project from the rail after full build out. We've actually rebacked this, we've made it worse lately. So this is like a rosy projection of all of that together, right? And so you can see it matters, but it's again, not a huge bulk of it. So the rail really needs riders. We'll just leave it at that. And then what if we could reduce vehicle miles traveled by 30% by doing sort of all of these interventions? Our back of the envelope calculation is that we need to increase the level of service of our bus system by 300% in order to reduce VMT by 30%. So what if we made our bus really, really good and got it to that level of service, and then we could further reduce emissions? And then we still have a ways to go, but these are the kinds of things we need to tick away at to get to a really good transportation system. And so here are my key takeaways. Hawaii's greenhouse gas emissions are really an energy sector issue. Electricity sector emissions are declining, but slowly. And continued realization of this, depends on having both large and decentralized projects. Really, it's about having projects everywhere and anywhere that you can get them, but addressing the land use implications of that are really important to proactively mitigate conflict. Lastly, the RPS, it is a really good tool. We do think it can reduce emissions, but it's just one sector, right? And so something like a carbon tax is much more economy-wide. I didn't go through the carbon tax results with electrification, but you can imagine, like, if you have a carbon tax, suddenly you're buying an EV, right? So it really, really impacts things like electrification and multimodal transportation. And giving money back to people can make this much, much more equitable. So that's a very important design component. And I'll leave it with, right now, I do think that if we're going to move climate policy forward, it's really important to do so at the state level, right? So that could change over time, And we, you know, it's had a really rough go in the US over the last 20 years in general. But there is a lot more thinking about how state level carbon taxation then leads to regional diffusion. And then ultimately, you really do want a national program, because that's gonna be the most efficient. All right, let's have some questions.
Thanks, McKenna. That was a very great. Thank you. That was a really great overview of not just, you know, where we are in the process of like decarbonization and hitting those targets, but also like how can we get there through a myriad of different policy tools, not just the carbon tax, but also the land use connections and how they're so important in getting us to where we need to go. And I think a lot of times that's left out, and that's like one of my biggest things about climate action plans is like they'll have the climate action plan, and then I'll ask the people presenting it, so where's your land use plan and how much sprawl do you have?
Right.
Because if you have sprawl, then that's it, like you can't really decarbonize at that rate. But yeah, so the lessons from Hawaii are really interesting in that context, tying it all back into land use with the climate action plans and everything that's going on. Brendan, so I'm gonna open it up for questions from students. Maybe we'll take some questions online. I know my students all wrote questions on their discussion chats that they can look up in the meantime if they've forgotten what they wrote to ask Dr. Kaufman. So yeah,
Can I maybe start then?
sure.
And then
We'll start with you.
to think of questions. Thanks, McKenna, as a really good, great case study of what we need to be doing. I'd like to begin by asking a little bit about the renewable energy policy and planning, because I'm just thinking about the land use implications. And you talked about 100% renewable by 2045. That's pretty soon, or quite far away, depending on your perspective. But has anybody actually sort of sat down and tried to map this out? So, for instance, what are the renewable energies? Which direction are we going to go with? Are we going to go with solar or offshore wind and so on and so forth? And here are the land use implications, and these are the costs involved. Has anybody done that yet?
Yes. Yeah, I would say maybe not perfectly what you said, but a pretty decent version of what you said has been done, led by our state energy office. So they have, our utilities are under something called an integrated grid planning process. And so they're required to produce these plans that show how they're going to get to 2045. Whether they're fully realistic, I have issues with, but they do have plans that show how they're going to get there. And then the state energy office has done a really nice job collaborating with one of our data scientists here on campus, visualizing that actually in a 3D map. So it's like an interactive 3D map where you can see where all of the solar and wind would have to go in order to get there. And it's both like, it strikes me as both like, oh, there's totally enough land, it's doable. And then when you actually dig into any particular area, region, or parcel, you're like, oh, no, it can't go there, right? So at a macro scale, there's a lot of land. And then at a more detailed scale, there's, you know, every piece is going to be a fight because it, you know, there's a reason why it can't go there.
And is the conclusion that it's feasible to actually meet that target, or does it sort of seem unrealistic and, you know, just it's not going to happen, or it will get to like, you get to like halfway there and so on? What about the feasibility side?
I think a growing majority of people who work in this on the daily think that it's infeasible.
Okay.
That will get really far. But that we won't get to 100%, right? So, for example, in the forecast that we just delivered to Department of Health, we have a forecast that projects future energy layout based on historic delays. And we say, what if we don't get any better in terms of speed, right? In comparison to what the plans say, in comparison to what actually goes in the ground. And we definitely don't get there. It's not even close.
Okay, great. Anyone else have questions? No questions from here for now. If you want to open it up, I'll
Yeah. Anyone want to ask one of your questions?
What departments would be in charge of managing or implementing this carbon tax? And what are some of the biggest obstacles that would be for implementing?
So Brendan, I don't know if you heard, but Julie's asking like, who would be responsible for implementation if Hawaii did go the way of the carbon tax? And what are some of the biggest obstacles that might be in the way?
So because we already have a barrel tax, implementation for that would actually remain identical to what it is. So it's really a combination between Department of Taxation, who collects the tax from the fossil fuel importers, and kind of the state energy office at a higher level, but kind of the actual implementation is Department of Taxation. And so the administrative burden is really on them, right? So implementing the carbon tax is really administratively easy because they already do it, but it's just at a really, really low level. Giving the monies back becomes a harder thing to do well, right? So what we recommended is that it go into our state income tax filing, and for median to high income earners, that it just becomes part of the state income tax filing. It becomes another line, right? And it become a refundable tax credit so that you don't have to have the tax liability, you could just get it back. And so that is actually wildly easy to implement, right? Adding lines within our state income tax thing is done all the time. And that would be easy. It's for non-filers and for low income groups that implementation is difficult. But we've tried to say, but important, right? Like we need to focus on that. So there's right, really low income people are not filers. So the challenge is, how do you get really low income people their revenue checks? And so we've suggested that we have like really low hanging fruit ways of just filling out a paper form and going into like City Hall and being able to get your check, right? Anyways, there's a lot of details in that, but I think that part of it is probably the most cumbersome because it's a new system. So in terms of actual administration, there isn't a lot of barrier. I think the biggest barrier is that nobody wants a new tax. Nobody wants anything that contracts the economy, right? Which is ironic because we're talking about all these other policies that are also contractionary. They're just not talked about in a tax, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm gonna come back to the classrooms online. Wolfgang, do you have a question, or the students from SCUBA? Yes, go ahead, Wolfgang.
Hi, yes, yeah, so I was quite interested in this, the Hawaii, is this the transportation greenhouse gases emission, like, I think that nowadays that we look into, so how people would choose their transportation modes. Some of them may drive alone, some of them use, like take a public transit, some biking, and also work from home. And then I'm curious about this, the work from home, so is this the work from home? Is this I see that the sample has covered quite a few years, like from the 2017 and also 2021, etc. So I was just curious, the work from home, was this influenced by the COVID-19 restrictions on mobility as well, or this the work or this the work from home has been like has existed for quite has existed for quite many years. Is this part of the life? Yeah, just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, Hawaii's always had a relatively large group of folks who work from home. And it's actually, I would, not perfect certainty, I would surmise that it's our proximity to Silicon Valley. Because if you look at the county data, the highest percentage of work from home of any county is right outside of San Francisco. It's Marin. So it's kind of like a tech sector thing, and because we have a lot of tech in Hawaii, but people who work remotely for tech in California, that's a lot, I think a lot of those numbers, and that predated COVID, and then it went up a lot during COVID.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
And then we've also gotten more work from home programs for like state employees and private sector here. But actually, I don't know that that would show up in the census data in the same way, because it's what is your predominant neighborhood, right?
Yeah, thank you.
I read this morning on the train that Elon Musk, with his new department, wants to stop work from home for public employees. So that will be interesting to see how that works out. I think he wants to make it so that a lot of public employees quit, and that will make his job of reducing the government spending significantly. But anyway, we have to see how that works out. Just going back to the carbon pricing, I like the idea of the dividend, and I also think that they can tie into other ideas out there, like the universal basic income idea. And I just wondered whether that was something that you were thinking about as well, especially if you can, for instance, you talked about the difficulty of getting that to low-income families and to non-filers, but is it just essentially is it a one lump sum payment for every household, regardless of their income status? Is that what you had in mind, or were you going to say high cap footprint households should receive less of a dividend? How would the mechanics work of that?
So the only thing you can't do in terms of the incentive structure is what you just said, right? So you cannot scale the dividend levels to carbon levels. Just economically, that then distorts the pricing effect, right? So as long as you don't do that, then the world is your oyster on what you want to do with the revenues. At that point, kind of revenues are revenues, money is money, and the government can do whatever they want with it. But then the question is, what are your secondary objectives, right? So for me, my secondary objective is to make this a more equitable policy that helps low-income people. Not everybody shares that, but starting with that as your secondary objective, I personally think that the dividend should be scaled towards lower income households. I don't think the top, say like decile to quintile, so the top 10 to 20% really should get a dividend. It doesn't make much sense to me. So I would argue for an income scaled dividend with heavier emphasis on lower income households. And then it becomes really akin to a universal basic income. I think the only danger of adding those two things together is that then the carbon policy becomes sort of like, well, now you can't get rid of fossil fuels because that's our universal basic income. Right, so it'll go down over time by design, right? That said, you could really well design this as a climate policy that spurs social policy, where you said, this is how we're going to start universal basic income. And once we get that infrastructure in place to give low-income people and non-filers checks, right, which isn't really that, you could do that, then we'll keep giving universal basic income. So I do think that there could be a dovetail, but it just has to be really clear.
Do you anticipate there could be opposition, especially, I know that you have a homeless problem in Hawaii, and it's also quite an attractive destination for people to come to. Do you think that if there was this kind of dividend available, people would come from mainland just to settle in Hawaii and get the dividend and enjoy the Hawaiian lifestyle? And as a result, you might have a lot of opposition from people already in Hawaii, from businesses and so on. Do you anticipate something like that, the social consequences?
I've definitely heard people bring that up, right? That, well, we can't have a better social safety net because then we'll have more people, right? To have a social safety net for, which I mean, I'm not that sympathetic towards that. I don't think it's a hard sell, right? Nobody would choose to be homeless for that dividend. But then again, anyways, I hear what you're saying, but yeah, I have definitely heard that. And like, for example, that's like the argument that we keep getting for the reason why we can't make the bus free here. Is if the bus is free, then it becomes the shelter. You're like, there has to be another way, right? There has to be another thing that does something like that, yeah.
Okay, right.
But yeah, clearly
It's-
we don't have enough social policy to start with, right? If that's kind of the thinking.
Are the social policies kind of like oriented towards how not to make it more hospitable?
Right. Not how to help people, yeah.
I have a question that was submitted online by one of the students. So I'll read that out. So they ask, increased prices for carbon intensive goods like fuel, will be passed on to the consumer, which will be felt immediately. On the other hand, the programs to invest the carbon tax back into Hawaiian communities will however take time. So I guess like the question of if there is a lag was not clear from the reading. So they're surmising there will probably be a lag between when they pay for it and when they receive something back. How can that lag be better reduced to lower the political cost of implementing the carbon tax and creating more voter buy-in?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something we didn't deal with in the study you read, but did deal in a separate study that was purely about administering this thing. And so our suggestion there was basically for middle to high income folks, then just do it within the annual shoring up of your taxes and tax refund, right? Because smoothing that out is easier for those income groups. But for people middle, low income and below, then, and particularly for really low income groups, non-filers, that the checks actually be given out on a quarterly basis to better deal with the timing of smoothing. So that it increases the administrative burden of it, but it, I think, is an important thing in order to make it kind of, people will be able to smooth their spending. The other thing that's been brought up that I think is a really good idea is for the government to do an estimate based on our study of how many revenues go out, and in the first year actually just be preemptive, like give it out first and then collect it.
Mine's a two-part question. Cause, the 300% increase in bus usage, can the bus handle that sort of capacity? Like if there was a 300% increase, or are they, would that require more buses or?
Way more buses,
Way more buses.
way more buses.
Because right now, I mean, they're pretty full. A lot of them are really full. Second, question is, has there been any, attempts at coordination with the military bases? Because even though they're federal, if there was like a bus that was, when I go on a base, whether it's Hickam, Pearl Harbor, or Schofield, or K-Bay, when you go on a base in the morning, it's all single people in their car.
Mm-hmm.
And have they, kicked around ideas about having a bus that just goes to the gate and then having the military have some sort of shuttle service within that could alleviate and actually have that bus increase?
My general sense is yes, there have been discussions, but that's like detailed DTS stuff that I'm not totally sure about. But yes, DTS does work with basically they plan the bus routes, right? And there's definitely coordination with the bus routes, with where, origin destination, right?
Mhm.
So, and military bases are a huge destination. One of our JERPU students many years ago, that was his job, was actually he was a transit planner on the base, right? So he was coordinating the shuttles once there. So I do know it happens, but like, why doesn't it happen better? I don't know.
Thanks, Jane. Oh, just 1 second, let me just check it.
We have a question here. Would you like to come
No.
up here at Osaka University? We have a question from a student.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. I was curious about like transport between the islands of Hawaii, and how I'm assuming like the main one at the moment is flights. And are there any ways to kind of reduce the carbon emissions of transport between islands, whether that be like a decentralization of administration on your main island, or more environmentally friendly transport systems between islands?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, it is actually only flights. We do not have a ferry or boat system between the islands. Kind of a complicated, long story, but we could, right, is the answer there. We did for like 1 month. But a lot of the concerns around boats are actually like limited, really not wanting cars to go on it, and there's a lot of invasive species issues between the islands. Of course, that can be mitigated, but it anyways changed kind of the economics if cars couldn't go. So everyone goes by plane, which is incredibly greenhouse gas intensive and frankly just really long. So it's I would say there's some promising things, but not on the direct horizon, right? So for really short, small flights, you know, there's a lot of innovation in solar planes for those kinds of flights, but I think that's really far off in actual commercial available. I'm not very optimistic about it in terms of actual, you know, scalable use. And then probably most of the greenhouse gas reductions will be gained through some blending of sustainable aviation fuels, and then better management of sort of like things that happen while at the airport. So reductions are modest on that sector in my perspective.
Okay, thank you very much.
McKenna, I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think we might actually see carbon pricing in Hawaii in the near future? And you know, have you been in conversations with the local politicians and local officials about timelines and going forward from here, or will you be presenting the same thing next year and the year after?
Give this presentation now, you know, you should give it next year. Gosh, the answer is I really hope it goes through. Honestly, the political moment okay, so the state was really interested, or at least it said it was really interested in carbon taxing, which is why it asked us to do the study. I think that they wanted us to find that it was terrible, but we actually found it was great. And then they were like, oh wait, we didn't actually want to do it. So, you know, there's been a lot of political pushback on like, well, no, those income results just can't be right, you know, or, well, we can't, you know, there's some low-income people that are going to be hurt. And you're like, yes, higher than average greenhouse gas consuming low-income people will not be made as well off as lower than average, right? And so but there's a lot of nitpicking over like all the reasons why it's not feasible. When I think you know, it's really quite feasible. So will it happen? I don't know. The political stars might align, right? Like it was actually after the first Trump administration that the state passed kind of the carbon net negative as like a rally, right? And I think they are starting. So there was a really huge lawsuit recently where basically there was a kids lawsuit against the Department of Transportation, and it was basically using our data, right? So the lawsuit was based on our greenhouse gas forecast, inventory and forecast of the transport sector, and saying you're not doing enough, right? There was a lot of details and it was a bit of a complicated lawsuit, but in the end, the state settled and has said, we're going to do way more on transport. And the truth is that it's the one sector that the state has less control on in comparison to fuel efficiency standards, except if it adopts carbon pricing. So the lawsuit might tie the state's hands a bit in terms of like, it's exhausted a lot of other things. The counties do all of the multimodal work, right? So for the state to really see it through, kind of takes a carbon price or an enormous gas tax, which is even more politically unpopular than a carbon price. So yeah, it could actually come together. We'll see. I'll tell you next year, or I'll send you an email. There's lots of excitement.
Seems like so much potential. It's a progressive administration. The research has been done. The renewable energy portfolio policies in place, the net zero by 2045 policies in place. You'd think that things would be moving rapidly in that direction. But I didn't get the impression, for instance, that there was a green mobility strategy there that was being strongly pushed. And yeah, I don't know what has to happen to really ensure that this accelerates, the implementation accelerates in Hawaii. Because it seems like everything's supporting it to happen, but I'm just wondering whether it's a political issue or an economic concerns and so on. What's the blockage?
I think it's largely a political issue, right? Nobody wants to be the person who passed a tax.
Okay.
Even with the dividend, like people don't feel the dividend is easy to explain, which is true. So like we recently met with kind of a nonprofit lobby group as well as a business group who were strategizing around like, how do we pass this? And so we had a conversation with some of the folks who were really involved in the British Columbia carbon tax, and so, former politicians and similar. And one of the pieces of advice they gave to the groups was, we gave back the monies, but actually because we put it in people's tax returns, it wasn't salient. So don't do that. Actually physically mail them a check, even though it's ridiculous, because saliency matters. So that was interesting advice that I would have never really thought about, but yeah.
Like everyone remembers the checks they got during COVID.
Everyone remembers the checks they got during COVID, and it was real exciting to cash, but if it's in your tax return, you don't even notice it.
Yeah.
So, no, yeah.
Brandon, I will add though that Hawaii, as McKenna said, that a lot of the transportation elements is covered by local governments. So that means the city and county governments actually control the planning for all of those elements. And so some of these like green mobility things that you're talking about is captured in the land use comprehensive plan updates that are happening. So building a lot more like biking infrastructure, connected greenways and things like that, both here on Oahu and also in other counties. Like Kauai is doing a lot of work around it. So there is a lot of movement in that space. Would we like to see more? Yes, but some of it is planning that happened before we were here and have is in place. Like for me, the rail corridor, for example, they started building the easiest part first.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of the hardest part, which is like generally how developments happen, is when you have the money, you build the hardest part because you have the money. That's the only part that is secured. So you would do that first and then build the rest of it. But they also build the part that doesn't actually connect
To any
people
destination.
So that's why the ridership is low. But they also built this in that same sort of like sentiment where we need to make it inhospitable. So there's no parking. So like if you want park to ride, it can't happen. There's no parking any of the train stops, and there are no restrooms at any of the train stops either. So it's a lot of infrastructure that would make it usable is missing.
We could have a whole lecture about this.
Just-
Our train was built in the exact opposite way that we would ever teach in a transit planning class. But it could eventually maybe be good, is my positive spin.
But they're gonna build it to Chinatown, then it'll go at least from somewhere to maybe somewhere. Yeah,
There's no riders.
no, but because there's no park to ride infrastructure. Like, so like if you get to the train station, what do you do with your car? Cause there's nowhere to park it. So like more, if, not explicit infrastructure, but like the services that go with it need to also be like planned with it. Otherwise, it's not functional. So that's my big gripe with it. Julie, go ahead.
Did they like do any research while they were planning the existing rail system, and is the university working on like updated plans for that?
I think the university sort of, along with everyone else, thrown up their hands and ran away from the rail system. I don't know if they're really working on it. It's terrible. We included in our greenhouse gas projections, of course, and so we definitely keep up to date on ridership. It's a system built for like tens and tens of thousands of people a day, and it has 4,000 people a day right now. It's not built out, it could get better, so not to say it's always gonna be like this, but it really was built in the exact opposite way. So back to your question, was it originally studied? Yes, it was originally studied, and, you know, the credible experts said, don't do this. And then the mayor at the time, who really wanted to become governor, said, this is how I'm doing it. Because he wanted the groundbreaking picture with him cutting the ribbon.
Okay,
Now he's on the radio.
We had a similar problem in the UK on a bigger scale with the high-speed rail, which was planned between London and Birmingham. And they've cancelled half of it now. But part of the problem was it was going through different political constituencies. And then each politician didn't want the train to ruin the landscape. So they had to tunnel. So the cost just went spiraling up, and it became a national embarrassment from one of these very.
It's still got like half the, it's going from London Euston, but it's meant to go to Manchester, and obviously it only goes to Birmingham now. Loads of like council houses all up with Euston got knocked down, people got moved to different places, and they went, oh yeah, it's just we'll move you in when it's done, to a new place when it's done, and it's been like 9 years.
Yeah.
And people are still living in like temporary houses because they've knocked down all these council houses to build the structures everywhere.
I think there is a theory about Western democracies aren't actually very good at big infrastructure projects anymore. That we've lost the capability to plan and implement them effectively, compared to the way we did that in the past. So anyway, yeah, interesting to see similarities.
Well, I mean, the way we did it in the past wasn't very good, because we essentially built highways through poor neighborhoods and cut off people. So I wouldn't say that our past is a good demonstration of how to do it well either, in some respect, comes to transportation planning. So,
Yeah, the hard one.
yeah. Brendan, do you have any questions in the room? We have a few minutes. I have a couple that the students have submitted here, but I wanted to check in. Anyone online have a question? No? Okay, so carbon tax, carbon pricing, cap and trade, all kind of fuel the same kind of consumption that got us into trouble with how much we're consuming and how much carbon we're emitting. If we implement these policies, whether it's cap and trade or there's a price on carbon or carbon tax, do the projections say that we will actually cut down on emissions, or we'll just consume in a different way?
Well, I mean, you'll definitely cut down on emissions, right? So if there's a carbon tax, you will cut down in emissions because you have taxed the pollution. I think maybe what the question's getting at is, will you start importing more carbon intensive goods and then not actually cut down on global emissions, right? So the issue between like what's done in your borders versus what's imported. And that is a really good point. So I think, you know, when we think about consumption-based greenhouse gas accounting, right? So I'll start with a little bit of history. Sorry, this is gonna be a long answer.
No, that's okay.
A little bit of history is the reason that everyone from the Kyoto Protocol, right? So late 1990s Kyoto Protocol, first major agreement, right? That was supposed to start a global carbon pricing scheme where globally we traded between countries. And so then it made tons and tons of sense for us to each do our own production-based greenhouse gas inventories. Because then if everybody had a like price, as was going to be implemented, then it didn't matter, right? This is a global pollutant. There should be a global like price. This was kind of like the economist's dream of doing it this way as most effective and efficient, and would have been wonderful, right? But similarly, the US came and never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. So history has repeated itself multiple times here. And I will say the George W. Bush administration almost put in a carbon tax or carbon cap and trade system, even after not ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. And the world would have been a really different place. Had he actually done that, right? That's the tax that would have been in 2024 dollars, $18 a ton and changed the world, right? So again, back to had the world implemented this together, as was the original plan in the late 90s, then this question would be irrelevant. But because, you know, we've not done that, and then everybody's doing it in this piecemeal fashion, then what's called leakage is a really big deal, right? And so leakage is this idea that if one place has a carbon tax, what you're gonna do is push production away to someplace else and then import more carbon intensive goods. And so in the worst outcome of leakage, you could actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. That is really rare. You have to have a really specific economic condition for that to really happen, right? Mostly, so leakage is an issue, leakage is definitely a problem, but mostly you still reduce emissions, right? Because there's no real reason why, unless you're implementing a carbon tax in a moderate fuel intensive manufacturing area, and then you're importing like really, really bad, like carbon-based, coal-based manufacturing, that's the only time leakage could really increase emissions, right? So that's not our case in Hawaii, I will state that, right? Like we don't manufacture almost anything. So leakage is a really small issue because of that. Our biggest concern about leakage in Hawaii is is a national concern, and any state that implements a carbon tax in Hawaii or in the US would have the same leakage problem. And it's the way that our national corporate fuel average fuel economy standards are governed. And it's a national average, which is a terrible way to do this. So basically, if one state implements a carbon tax and then you get all these electric vehicles on the road, you can actually then sell more gas guzzlers in another state because the average is met, right? So that is our biggest source of leakage. We actually did quite a bit of sleuthing on leakage when we were doing the work, and leakage from imports is really small. It is definitely not our biggest concern. Leakage from transportation is much bigger, but no one in the US is going to solve that unless we solve it together.
Thanks, McKenna. That actually brings us to time, and that I think is a really great note to end class on. Is like, if we don't do this together, then it's not going to get done. We need to make progress, and like as in one of your maps we saw, crisis leads to innovation, and that innovation then has the potential to diffuse more intensely. And maybe a moment of crisis will spur something more, as we saw in that first 2017 to 2020 period. And maybe there will be, not a race to the bottom, but a different kind of race that will be spurred by all of this. And that is the silver lining I'm taking away from your presentation, is that there was that policy diffusion, and there's a high potential we might see it again as different states try to figure out how to keep their own standards and work on the things that are important to them, and not be meddled by the federal government.
Yeah.
Despite whatever happens in the larger policy world. Brendan, any last words? Brendan Wolfkin, before we close off?
Just to say thank you, McKenna, for a really excellent lecture and a great discussion. I feel we could talk much more, but leave it for another time. And,
I'm just gonna put out, one of the reasons, Brendan, I wanted to give my Seal Rise presentation is because I feel like you could give this presentation. So next year, if a carbon tax has not passed, I'm gonna present on Seal Rise. Okay. But if it has passed, I'll give a totally different presentation.
Sounds great.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe we can show our appreciation to McKenna. Okay, see everyone next week.